Nazanin ZaghariRatcliffe is a British-Iranian woman who has been in jail in Iran for nearly 19 months. The Iranian regime claims she was working against the state when she was arrested on a visit to the country to see her parents with her daughter. Image Nazanin ZaghariRatcliffe with her husband Richard. Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson has said he will be traveling to Iran later this year and will leave no stone unturned in his attempts to win her release. Here is a timeline of events that have left a family split apart and resulted in diplomacy at the highest level. Image Mrs. ZaghariRatcliffe's daughter is now living with her grandparents in Iran. October 2010 joins Thomson Reuters Foundation. Nazanin ZaghariRatcliffe joins the Thomson Reuters Foundation, a charity that says it promotes socio-economic progress and the rule of law through a series of training programs. Before the move, she worked for BBC Media Action for around 18 months, the corporation's international development charity which uses the power of media and communication to help reduce poverty and support people in understanding their rights. Image Richard Ratcliffe wants to accompany the Foreign Secretary on his visit to Iran. June 2014 birth of her daughter Gabriella, the only daughter of Mrs. ZaghariRatcliffe and her husband Richard, is born in the UK and grows up in St John's Wood, North London. In the next 22 months, Mrs. ZaghariRatcliffe and her daughter traveled to Iran 4 times to see family. The 17th of March 2016 travel to Iran. Mrs. ZaghariRatcliffe travels to Iran to visit her family for Nowruz, the Persian New Year festival, with her then 22-month-old daughter. Image Gabriella was 22 months when her mother was arrested in Iran. The 3rd of April 2016 arrested at the airport as she and her daughter prepared to board a flight back to the UK at Tehran's Imam Khomeini Airport. She is approached by members of Iran's Revolutionary Guard and arrested. Her daughter's passport is confiscated. The reason for her arrest is not made public. She is held the day after British-Iranian relations are partially restored following the announcement of a general framework outlining the broad parameters of a nuclear deal. Relations had broken down in 2011 when the British embassy was stormed by students supportive of the regime, during a demonstration against sanctions. Image family and supporters tied ribbons to mark 365 days since Nazanin was imprisoned. The 16th of June 2016 regime change claims. Press TV, the state-owned and controlled English and French-language Iranian news channel, claims Ms. ZaghariRatcliffe was involved in plans for regime change in Iran, allegations she denies. An article says she was identified after a large intelligence operation and was one of the liaison officers of networks hostile to Iran abroad. Press TV's source tells the channel she carried out several missions and conducted her criminal activities under the direction of media and intelligence services of foreign governments. Gabriella, meanwhile, goes to live with her grandparents. Mrs. ZaghariRatcliffe is prevented from seeing her daughter for 38 days. The first time she is brought to the jail, Gabriella is forced to wear a sack over her head to disguise where her mother is being held, the Evening Standard reported. July 2016 3 others indicted. Iran's Revolutionary Guard says Mrs. ZaghariRatcliffe participated in the design and implementation of cyber and media projects to cause the soft toppling of the Islamic Republic, allegations she denies. It also reveals that 2 other dual nationals and a foreigner have been indicted. They are Homehud Far, an Iranian-Canadian woman who is a retired university professor, Sial Maknamazi, an Iranian-American businessman, and Nazar Zakha, a permanent U.S. resident from Lebanon who has done work for the U.S. government. Image Richard Ratcliffe says his wife's physical and mental health is getting worse. Theresa May raises concerns about the plight of Mrs. ZaghariRatcliffe with Iran's President Rouhani. During a phone conversation, the PM mentions a number of consular cases involving dual nationals, including that of the 37-year-old charity worker. A Downing Street spokesman said Mrs. May stresses the importance of resolving such cases as the 2 countries work on forming closer ties. Mrs. ZaghariRatcliffe meanwhile is receiving no direct consular assistance from the UK as Iran refuses to recognize dual nationality and denies foreign ministries access. The 6th of September 2016 sentenced to 5 years after spending 150 days in detention, Mrs. ZaghariRatcliffe is sentenced to 5 years in prison on charges that remain secret. And petition calling for her release passes 800,000 signatures. The Minister for the Middle East, Tobias Ellwood, meets the family to reassure them the Foreign Office will continue to do all it can. Image Richard Ratcliffe wants to accompany the Foreign Secretary on his visit to Iran. The 9th of September 2016, Richard Ratcliffe finds out his wife won't be released. The 37-year-old mother calls her husband Richard and reveals she is due to be held in jail for several more years, expressing her disbelief at the sentence. She begs him to do whatever he can to secure her release and tells him they said that sometimes you can settle cases on appeal through payment but not often cases like mine. So I don't know how long it will go on taking. She is being held in the notorious Evin prison, a jail described by freed inmates as a black hole, where political prisoners are tortured. Mrs. Zaghari-Ratcliffe's lawyer is instructed to appeal against the decision, but no date for the appeal is set. April 2017, Iran upholds 5-year sentence. Iran's Supreme Court upholds the 5-year prison sentence, giving her no more legal options to overturn it. Richard Ratcliffe calls for the government to step up its efforts to free her. Theresa May raises her plight with Iran, according to a Foreign Office statement. Image Gabriella Zaghari-Ratcliffe holds a sign calling for her mother's release. August 2017, Nazanin in a fragile state. Richard Ratcliffe tells Sky News his wife is in a fragile state and has seen a psychiatrist who diagnosed she has advanced depression. Mr. Ratcliffe says she's been talking in very dark terms about what she might do. His comments come ahead of a visit to Iran by Foreign Office Minister Alastair Burt, at which he raises her case. September 2017, May speaks to Rouhani again. Theresa May speaks to Iranian President Hassan Rouhani about the case on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly. October 2017, 2 more charges. Mrs. Zaghari-Ratcliffe has told she faces 2 more charges, with prosecutors alleging she joined organizations which specifically work to overthrow the government. The Guardian says Tehran's prosecutor general claimed that Mrs. Zaghari-Ratcliffe was detained because she was running a BBC Persian journalism course. The Iranian regime has a long-standing enmity towards the BBC's Persian service, which is banned in Iran but reaches people via satellite and on shortwave bandwidths, as well as. In the past, the Iranian regime has frozen the assets of its staff and harassed and intimidated their family members, according to the BBC. Mrs. Zaghari-Ratcliffe is also accused of joining a demonstration outside the Iranian embassy in London, with authorities claiming they have photographic evidence. Image Boris Johnson's heir was seized on by Iranian prosecutors. The 1st of November 2017, Johnson's big blunder. Boris Johnson appears at a meeting of the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Select Committee where he criticizes Iran for detaining Mrs. Zaghari-Ratcliffe before saying, "When I look at what Nazanin ZaghariRatcliffe was doing, she was simply teaching people journalism as I understand it. Neither Nazanin ZaghariRatcliffe nor her family has been informed about what crime she has actually committed. And that I find extraordinary, incredible." Mrs. Zaghari-Ratcliffe is summoned to court in Tehran where the Foreign Secretary's comments are used as evidence against her, with prosecutors saying she was engaged in propaganda against the regime. The new case is opened up a month before she is eligible for early release. She could face an extra 16 years in jail. Image Nazanin ZaghariRatcliffe denies working to topple the Iranian regime. The 7th of November 2017, Johnson tries to contain his mistake. Boris Johnson announces he plans to visit Iran, after speaking with Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif in an effort to contain the fallout from his blunder. The Foreign Office says the Foreign Secretary expressed concern that his remarks to the Foreign Affairs Committee were claimed by the Iranian Judiciary High Council for Human Rights to have shed new light on the case. Mr. Zarif is said to have told Mr. Johnson developments in the British-Iranian national's case were unrelated to his comments. There are calls for Mr. Johnson to be sacked, as he admits he could have been clearer. The 12th of November 2017, Nazanin on verge of breakdown. A family statement says Mrs. Zaghari-Ratcliffe has found new lumps in both her breasts and is on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Richard Ratcliffe says the Foreign Secretary's words have added to his wife's despair, but says it would not be in her interest for him to be sacked. Boris Johnson calls Mr. Ratcliffe and agrees to meet. It comes after Mr. Johnson's ally, Michael Gove, compounds his error by saying "I don't know" when asked what he thinks the charity worker was doing in Iran. The 13th of November 2017 p.m. slaps down Johnson and Gove. The Prime Minister's spokesman effectively admonishes Mr. Johnson and Mr. Gove by telling journalists that British government policy is that Mrs. Zaghari-Ratcliffe was on holiday when she was arrested. Image. Boris Johnson held talks with Mr. Ratcliffe after his comments to MPs. The 15th of November 2017 Johnson meets Richard Ratcliffe. Mr. Ratcliffe, after a meeting with Mr. Johnson described as constructive, reveals the Foreign Secretary is keen for Mrs. Zaghari-Ratcliffe's husband to accompany him to Iran. It emerges Gabriella can no longer speak English, which makes it difficult for her to converse with her father during phone calls. Image. Mr. Johnson and Richard Ratcliffe spoke about the possibility of giving his wife diplomatic protection. The 16th of November 2017 GOVT offering Iran £450 million. Sky News is told the government is considering settling an outstanding £450 million debt with Iran as part of attempts to secure Mrs. Zaghari-Ratcliffe's release. The sum is owed after Britain received the money for an order of 1,750 tanks in the late 1970s. But only 185 were delivered when the order was cancelled in the wake of Iran's 1979 Islamic Revolution. There is much debate over whether the cash should be viewed as a ransom payment, something the UK say it does not pay.